Chances are that you have never seen these, maybe not even heard about them. Germany's blue steam locomotives. But they did exist, even though it was just for a very short time and in an even smaller quantity. In 1974 introduced the West German Bundesbahn the new ivory and ocean blue livery, which we have talked about before on this channel, in particular how poorly it was received by enthusiasts back then. But steam locomotives were, at that point, not really supposed to be still around. However, an unexpected economic boost in 1969 meant that some of them were still needed a little bit longer. And the West German end of steam shouldn't come before 1977. But in 74, still around 600 steam locomotives are in service, with unsurprisingly about 2/3 of them being Class 50 locomotives. And that means that the Bundesbahn has more than enough reasons, about 600 of them, to experiment with a new paint scheme even on steam locomotives. And for that, 3 locomotives were chosen: a Prussian T16.1, number 094055, of course a Class 50, number 052474, and a rebuilt oil-burning Class 41, arguably one of the most advanced steam locomotives with goods trains Germany ever saw, number 042166. Yeah, by the way, I really should finally do the video explaining the computer numbers on steam locomotives. 1974 was actually not the first time the Bundesbahn painted some of their steam locomotives in blue. Already back in the 1950s, had just a handful of express locomotives been painted in steel blue to match the respective F-Zug coaches. But that was only for a couple of years, and this time it should be even shorter. To be upfront about it, even back in the day it must have been obvious to anyone that these new liveries wouldn't make it very far, that they would be doomed to remain one-offs, and not because enthusiasts, unsurprisingly, did not like them, but rather because there is no point in repainting a locomotive that's supposed to be withdrawn fairly soon anyway. Especially unfortunate was in this regard the T16.1. It was given the new paint scheme towards the end of 1974, and towards the end of 1974 was also when this class was finally entirely withdrawn. The liveries for the Class 50 and 41 were pretty much identical. The frames and wheels were painted almost entirely in brown grey, with only the rods showing a little bit of red, while most of the upper structures, boiler, cab, tender body, were painted in ocean blue. And the smoke box was painted in ivory, which made a steam locomotive even more visible from afar. On the other hand was a warning panel on the backside of a tender locomotive, generally deemed unnecessary as they wouldn't lead a train tender first. However, with the Class 50 being what it is, being often used tender first, especially on branch lines, here an ivory warning panel was applied to the back. The T16.1 on the other hand, your typical heavy shunting locomotive, received an even more flashy application of the livery. If you compare it, it is very similar to how it was applied to the V60 shunters. So also the wheels were painted in red, and the complete running board was bordered in ivory, the buffer beams even completely painted in it. The same is true for various steps and handrails, to make working with them, especially during shunting, much safer, and also the decorative stripe, which on the tender locomotives was just applied to the cab itself. On the T16.1 runs around the complete boxy part of the superstructure, tank, cab and bunker. However, despite being this locomotive regarded as a shunter, an additional warning panel towards the back was not applied because already the buffer beam was painted in ivory, so that was deemed sufficient. And it being a shunter is what I assume is probably the sole reason it was chosen to be repainted, simply to see how an even flashier version of the livery would look like. So there is some logic behind it, but at the same time, the purpose of this experiment was always very, very questionable. Therefore, it's also no surprise that the Bundesbahn was rather hesitant to present those liveries to the public, very much unlike what they did with the modern traction locomotives. However, what's not true, but often enough stated, that officials tried to hide those liveries and any information about them was deemed confidential. That's just utter nonsense. The Bundesbahn had simply no motivation to show them off, and already in 1975, also the two repainted tender locomotives disappeared with their withdrawals. And what's left nowadays? Not much more than a pretty much forgotten memory. I personally do think that these paint schemes suit the bigger locomotives actually quite well. On the T16.1, however, it is quite busy looking. But not in the busy bee way, but rather the clattered way of being busy. But then again, maybe if it stuck around for a bit longer, we would have gotten used to it. But so as it is, there are just a colorful footnote of something that should have never been, but still made it into the fabric of reality. Oh well, please stay civil in the comments, but let me know, what do you think of those liveries? Thank you Patreon and YouTube members for supporting my research, model and video making. I would not be able to do it without you. But before you head off, one last thing. I would highly encourage you to check the upload date of this video. See you in the next one!